On today's program, I interview Charles Reichblum. Charles is the author of the 11-book Knowledge in a Nutshell series. His latest book is the all-time book of fascinating facts, and today he's here to share with us many of the facts in this book. To learn more about Charles Reichblum, visit knowledgeinanutshell.com. Charles Reichblum, welcome to the program.
Well, Russell, good being with you.
Charles, they say no one likes a know-it-all. How do people respond to you? And tell me something I don't know.
We usually try to have fun with the questions, and people are usually surprised. There's some of these questions and stories that surprisingly are not well known. For example, we were talking before we went on the air here. One man was on the scene when 3 U.S. presidents were assassinated. That's an incredible fact. That one man was there when 3 different U.S. presidents were assassinated. We've had just 4 assassinations in our history. One man was there for 3 of them over a period of many years. It's just an incredible fact, and if you want me to tell the answer to that, I will. The amazing thing about that, Russell, is I don't ever remember learning about that in school. I don't ever remember any history teacher bringing that up. And in speeches I give and radio interviews, I ask people, did you ever hear of this? And most people haven't, which is really surprising considering, how amazing this fact is. And shall we get into the answer?
Tell me the answer, Dr. Knowledge.
Okay. The man who was on the scene when 3 different U.S. presidents were assassinated was Robert Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's son. Robert, of course, was with his father right after Abraham Lincoln was shot in 1865. No surprise about that. But then 16 years later, in 1881, Robert Lincoln had gotten into politics himself in the intervening years and was in the cabinet of President Garfield, James Garfield. And in 1881, Garfield was leaving on a train trip from the Washington Railroad station. The cabinet went down to say goodbye to him, and a man came up and shot Garfield there at the train station. It was a man described as a disappointed office seeker. He felt Garfield had promised him a job, and he didn't get the job. And in any case, he pulled out a revolver and shot Garfield, assassinated him, and Robert Lincoln was standing about 2 feet away from Garfield when Garfield was shot. And then incredibly, 20 years later, in 1901, by this time Robert Lincoln had become a very successful businessman. He was president of the Pullman Company, which was a big deal in those days, and was also president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce because he was head of the Pullman Company. And President McKinley, William McKinley, invited Robert Lincoln to a business exposition in Buffalo, New York. He invited him there because Lincoln was head of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And just as Robert Lincoln walked in the exhibition hall, there was a receiving line, and that's where McKinley was shot. There was a man described as an anarchist who had a revolver hidden. He had his hand bandaged, and he had the revolver hidden under the bandage. They didn't have metal detectors in those days, or security wasn't like it is today. This guy got in the receiving line, and when he came up to McKinley, he shot McKinley, and Robert Lincoln was standing right there as that assassination took place. So we say in our book, the all-time book of fascinating facts, that after that happened, Robert Lincoln vowed he would never again get anywhere near a president, and we say probably nobody would have invited him anyhow. And as a matter of fact, he lived another 25 years. He lived till 1926, Robert Lincoln, and was very wealthy. He had accumulated a lot of money, built a beautiful mansion in Vermont, which is still there and is a tourist attraction. It's in Manchester, Vermont, which is a big shopping area, and his mansion there is open to the public, and people go there to see it. It's a beautiful home. And that's where he lived the last years of his life, never went to Washington again, and never got anywhere near a president because he felt he was a real jinx.
It's like the James Dean card.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. Yeah.
And 3 of the first 5 presidents all died on July the 4th.
Isn't that amazing? First of all, the oddity that 3 of the first 5 presidents would all die on the same date is amazing, of unrelated causes. And of all the dates in the year, it was July 4th. And the story is that the second president, John Adams, died on July 4th, 1826. He was in Massachusetts when he died. On the same day, July 4th, 1826, Thomas Jefferson, the third president, was in Virginia, and he died that day. In fact, when Adams was dying, among his last words supposedly were, "Well, Jefferson lives." He did not know that Jefferson had also died that day. Of course, there was no instant communication in those days. There was no radio or TV or telephones or telegraph. So Adams had no idea that Jefferson had also died earlier that same day. And then the fifth president, James Monroe, died on July 4th, 1831. Just amazing that 3 of the first 5 presidents would die on the same date, and of all the dates in the year, it would be July 4th. And Russell, we almost had 4 of the first 5 dying on July 4th because the fourth president, James Madison, died on June 28th. He almost made it to July 4th. We almost had 4 of the first 5 dying on July 4th.
Well, if he knows what's good for him, Donald Trump will not be visiting the grave of Rob Lincoln this Independence Day.
Probably not. There's an interesting fact about Trump, by the way, whether you're a pro-Trump person or anti-Trump. This has not been reported very much. I'm kind of surprised. Most people don't seem to be aware of this. But Trump is the oldest person ever elected president for the first time. He set that record in November. Ronald Reagan had previously been the oldest. Reagan was 69 when he was first elected president. Trump is 70. He was 70 last year ago, June. So he holds the record now as being the oldest president ever elected president for the first time. And the other surprising thing about that, Russell, is that of all the presidents in U.S. history, only 3 have been in their 70s. You look at pictures of the old presidents, so many of them looked like real old men, but none was in their 70s until Dwight Eisenhower, who was just 70 when he left office. He was 70 in 1961. And then came Reagan, who was elected at age 69 and served into his 70s, and now Trump. And those are the only 3 70-year-old presidents we've had.
Yeah, I think he's almost the fattest president, too.
No, I think there was a guy named William Howard Taft.
Of course, but next to Taft, he must be the fattest.
Yeah. The great story about Taft is a lot of people discount this story, but there are pictures of this. He was so heavy, so fat, he got stuck in the White House bathtub, and he had to have a couple aides pull him out of the bathtub. And the reason we know that's a true story, there's a picture of which is around in some history books. Workers came to install a new, bigger bathtub for William Howard Taft, and there's a picture of like 3 of the workers. The tub was so big that 3 guys were sitting in it after they installed it. They took a picture of the 3 people in the tub. That's how big it was. Taft was president 1908 to 1912. He ran for a second term in 1912 and lost to Woodrow Wilson. So he was a one-term president, but he was quite heavy. And by the way, just one other little fact about him: he started the tradition of throwing out the first pitch on opening day in baseball. He was the first official ever to do that. He was a great baseball fan, and went to a Washington, then called the Senators, a Washington Senators game, and started the tradition of a public official throwing out the first pitch on opening day.
Keeping with the sports theme, as a Canadian, I have a question. Who invented basketball? Because we say that we did it.
Was it basketball?
Yes.
A guy named James Naismith in Springfield, Massachusetts in the late 1800s, and there's a wonderful story about him. He later became a head coach at the University of Kansas. He was there for about 8 or 9 years as head coach. after about 10 years after he invented the game. And he was a losing coach. He had a losing record. He was a losing coach in the sport that he invented, which is kind of surprising. He was, for you had mentioned Canada when we were talking earlier before we went on the air here. He was originally from Canada, worked for the YMCA and headed the YMCA in Springfield, Massachusetts, and that's where he invented basketball. He wanted some activity for the guys who couldn't exercise outside during the winter, and came up with the game. And there's another fact about that, Russell, we have in our book. The game almost could have had a different name, because he wanted boxes to be put up at each end of the court, and asked the janitor at the YMCA where he was to find 2 boxes that he could nail up to the balcony, and the players would have to shoot the ball into the boxes. Well, the janitor couldn't find any boxes, but he did find, just by chance, 2 peach baskets. And he put the 2 peach baskets up at each end of the court, and the players started calling the game basketball because baskets were there. But had the janitor found what Naismith wanted him to get, some boxes, the game might have been called box ball. We might have had boxes instead of baskets at each end of the court.
We have a question from the audience. They want to know what your thoughts are on the Apollo 11 landing on the moon. Did it really happen? Do you have any fascinating facts about that?
Yeah, there's one amazing fact about that. First of all, I think obviously it did happen, because I know there are conspiracy theorists who say it didn't. It was filmed from New Mexico or Arizona or something like that. But my point on that is, I think so many people were involved in that whole operation. It would just be incredible that somebody wouldn't have talked since all that time, if indeed it didn't happen. I'm sure it did happen. But in any case, the crew of Apollo 11, which put the first man on the moon, their names were Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. And their last name initials are AAC, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins, putting the first men on the moon. The biblical first men on Earth were Adam, Abel, and Cain, also with the same initials, AAC. And we say in our book, is that a coincidence or not? Maybe it's not a coincidence, I don't know.
So let me ask you about conspiracy theories in general. Do you tend to believe in them, or as a fact-based guy, do you sway away from conspiracy theories?
Well, I think, you need some proof. There's always people who are going to say, something didn't happen or something did happen. Sometimes they're right. I think the assassination of Kennedy, nobody to this day knows for sure if Lee Harvey Oswald was the only shooter, and nobody knows why he did it. He was killed a couple days later. And again, the person who killed him, that fellow named Jack Ruby, nobody knows for sure why he did that. Was he trying to keep him quiet? We don't know, and I think after all these years, we never will know. It's been so long. And the Warren Commission, which investigated the Kennedy assassination, really swept facts under the rug. That they wanted to reach a verdict quickly to calm the country down, and I don't think they had a thorough investigation of what happened. And, did Oswald act alone, or did some foreign government have him do it, or some people accuse the mob of having had it done? We don't know, and I don't think we'll ever know. But that leads to a couple pages in our book, the All-Time Book of Fascinating Facts, that I think your listeners will like. We get more requests for this, and that is all the similarities in the assassinations of Kennedy and Abraham Lincoln. And I don't know if I can remember all of them, but I'll try and give you the ones I can think of here. There's a whole bunch of them. First of all, both Kennedy and Lincoln were shot on a Friday. Both were sitting next to their wife when they were shot. Neither wife was injured. Kennedy was succeeded by a man named Lyndon Johnson. Lincoln was succeeded by a man named Andrew Johnson. Both Andrew Johnson and Lyndon Johnson have the same number of letters in their names. The assassins each had three-word names: John Wilkes Booth, who shot Lincoln; Lee Harvey Oswald, who shot Kennedy. Both those names have the same number of letters. Andrew Johnson was born in 1808. Lyndon Johnson was born in 1908. Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860. Kennedy in 1960. Both were pronounced dead in a place that had the initials PH. Lincoln was taken across the street after he was shot at Ford's Theater in Washington. He was taken across the street and put in a bed in a rooming house across the street called the Peterson House, the initials PH. Kennedy was taken to Parkland Hospital, where he was pronounced dead, and again, the initials were PH. Lincoln had sons named Robert, as we've talked about, Robert and Edward, and Kennedy had brothers named Robert and Edward. Kennedy's secretary was named Lincoln. Lincoln's secretary was named Kennedy. And the final kicker is that the car in which Kennedy was riding when he was shot was a Lincoln.
Do you have any more fascinating facts on Donald Trump? People are endlessly fascinated with him right now.
Yeah, well, of course, he's the first person to be president who has never been in government or the military, There are some presidents we had who had never been in a political job but had been in the military. Some had been both, but he's the first never to have been either in the military or in a political or government job. So that's one fact. He's the first president divorced twice. The only other divorced president we've had, by the way, is Ronald Reagan, who was married to actress Jane Wyman, and shortly after she won an Oscar for Best Actress for Johnny Belinda in the 1940s, they got a divorce, and he married Nancy Davis, who eventually became First Lady. No other president has been divorced, and Trump, of course, has been divorced. This is his third wife currently. Just trying to think any other. He went to an Ivy League college, which so many presidents have. Many presidents have gone to Harvard, especially lately. Almost all the recent presidents have gone to either Harvard undergraduate or Harvard graduate school. Trump went to University of Pennsylvania, which is an Ivy League school. So those are some of the things on him.
And he's a Republican, and something that I've kind of wondered about is why are the Republican states called red states and the Democratic states called blue states?
Well, as a matter of fact, we have that in our book. Originally, there was no standard, and different newspapers, different TV networks used different sets of colors to identify states as being Democratic or Republican. And it was very confusing, especially into the 1990s. People would tune into one network and they'd see Republican states being called red or blue or green or some other color, and then some other network would have a different set of colors. So finally, for the 2000 election between George W. Bush and Al Gore, the networks and a couple of the major newspapers got together and had a meeting and said, let's standardize this. Let's all use the same color combination so there'll be no confusion. And a man from the New York Times, the graphics editor of the New York Times, raised his hand and said, I'll tell you what I do. He says, I make the Republican states red and the Democratic states blue because Republican and red both start with the same letter, R. He said it's very easy, to remember that way. And so they adopted that, and that was why those colors were chosen. And the good thing about that is it is an easy way to remember. If you ever are wondering about which is which, Republican and red both start with R. And So Republican states are called red and Democratic states are called blue.
But why is one an elephant and one a donkey?
Well, that goes back into the 1800s. There was a cartoonist named Thomas Nast, who was a very well-known, influential cartoonist for some of the leading magazines and newspapers in the 1800s. He had come to the United States from Germany, Thomas Nast. He created one of the modern pictures of Santa Claus, among other things. He was an ardent Republican. He was very close to Ulysses Grant, who was a Republican president. And Grant won his election, and Nast was very happy about that. And so he had got a picture of an elephant. He drew a picture for his cartoon of an elephant stomping the opposition, the competition, and began using the elephant as a symbol for the Republicans. The Republicans liked that very much, so they adopted the elephant and have used it ever since as their symbol. Meantime, in a later election, the Democrats won. It wasn't a presidential election. It was some kind of local or congressional investigation. Anyhow, he drew a cartoon of a donkey kicking up his heels in happiness, and he had the donkey represent the Democratic Party, and the Democrats liked that. So in the late 1800s, they adopted Nast's symbol as the donkey, and both those symbols have lasted all these years.
Here's a fact for you. My great uncle was General Ulysses Grant.
Is that right? Oh.
Yeah, that's true.
Wow. Well, that's amazing. Very, very good. He, of course, led. There's a story about him. I don't think you'll mind if I tell this. He was a pretty good drinker, Grant, as you probably know. In fact, he was kicked out of West Point. He did not graduate from West Point originally. And among the things was his excessive drinking. And while he was, Lincoln liked him very much. Lincoln had appointed him, when the Civil War started, they needed all the leaders they could get in the military. And even though Grant had not graduated West Point, he was picked to lead different squadrons. He had an Army background, a West Point background. And he became very successful. He won several battles, and he caught the eye of Lincoln, who really grew to like Grant, had a lot of confidence in him, and Lincoln kept promoting him until he finally promoted him as this supreme leader of the Union forces. And then people would say, yeah, but this guy, drinks a lot. He's a big drinker. And Lincoln says, well, I wish my other generals would drink as much as he did, to get the same kind of success he's having. He said maybe that's what they ought to do, because he was really enamored with Grant, Lincoln, and of course Lincoln made him head of the Union forces eventually.
But not considered one of the great presidents.
No, there are lists, different lists. I'm not saying this because he was an ancestor of yours, but he was reelected to a second term, which says something. He did serve 2 terms. That says something for him. And that was a tough period after the Civil War, unifying the nation again. Interesting thing about his name too, that really wasn't his. He was born with the name Hiram Ulysses Grant, and when he was recommended to West Point by a congressman who was friendly with the family, they were from Ohio. The congressman knew his mother, whose maiden name was Simpson, and for whatever reason changed his name from Hiram Ulysses to Ulysses Simpson Grant, and he put that on the application, recommending Grant to be appointed to West Point. And when Grant got there, he looked at that and was going to make a change, but he decided he liked that name better than his real name, Ulysses Simpson Grant. He didn't like the name Hiram to begin with as a first name, so he went by Ulysses Simpson Grant the rest of his life. And the interesting thing about that, Russell, is that he then had the initials U.S., Ulysses Simpson Grant, and during the war he called for an unconditional surrender, so they started calling him Unconditional Surrender Grant, which helped his image among the northern forces. And also, as you know, those were great initials for a president, U.S. Grant, president of the U.S. So he, even though that wasn't his real name, it turned out to be very good. Speaking of that, speaking of names, we have this in our book. And this fellow was just in the news the other day. There is a senator, a current senator in the U.S. Senate from Rhode Island, a Democrat from Rhode Island by the name of Sheldon Whitehouse. That's his real name. His last name is Whitehouse. And we say if anybody ever had a great name to be president, it would be it would be this senator. He's in his second term as a senator from Rhode Island. You don't hear much about him. He was just in the news the other day. He's co-chairman of a committee in Congress, and they made some report. But wouldn't it be something if he would be elected president someday, and you could say President Whitehouse today at the White House said such and such. And that is his real name. That's an old family in New England, the Whitehouse family. Incidentally, I'd like to get in, Russell, if you don't mind. The name of our book is The All-Time Book of Fascinating Facts. People want to read more about the book and even order if they want to. They can go to our website, which is knowledgeinanutshell.com, knowledgeinanutshell.com, or we have an 800 number, 1-800-NUTSHELL. The book, by the way, sells for $19.95. That includes shipping and handling. That's the total price. And again, it's knowledgeinanutshell.com for the website.
How many pages?
It's 306 pages. It's paperback, 6 by 9 in size, 6 inches across, 9 inches long. And there's over 500 of these kind of stories in the book.
You sure know your stuff. Have you ever applied to be on Jeopardy?
No, never have. And a friend of mine, interestingly enough, tried out, and he said the hardest thing, aside from trying to come up with the answer, is the reflexes you have to have. You have to hit that buzzer, real quick. And he said that's the trouble he had. He knew the answer, but it wasn't quite as quick as some of the other contestants.
Well, I talked to you before the show about I was on Reach for the Top. That was my problem. I knew all the answers, but I couldn't get the buzzer in time. I was competing with 6 other people.
Yeah, that is a problem, and I don't have the agility probably I once did. I used to play a lot of baseball, but I don't think I can scoop up those balls today like I used to when I was a kid. So that is a problem.
Let's move into fascinating facts about food and start with why there's a hole in a donut.
Originally, donuts had no hole in them. They were just like cakes. And there was a sea captain off the coast of Rockport, Maine. His name was Hanson Gregory. And he loved to eat donuts while he was piloting his ship. And, of course, the waters, especially in wintertime, are very rough around Maine, where he was located. So he always had donuts by his steering wheel, and they used to slide all around in the rough waters. So he got the idea of getting a spike, and he put the donuts on a spike so they wouldn't roll all around by his steering wheel. And that put the hole in donuts, and other nearby sailors, he told them about it, or they saw it, and so they started doing it. And it's kind of a hard story to believe, but that is how it started, and we know that it's verified today. There is a plaque in Rockport, Maine. If you ever go to Rockport, Maine, there's a plaque there in downtown Rockport which says, Rockport, Maine, the home of Hanson Gregory, the man who put the hole in donuts. So that's apparently how it started. That's the story most historians accept as the reason, and the tradition just started growing of having the hole in donuts. As far as hamburgers go, it's interesting to note that when we have a hamburger, we never stop to think there is no ham in hamburgers. So why in the world do we call them hamburgers when there is no ham in hamburgers? And the answer to that story is, there's no question about this, a whole lot of German immigrants came to the United States in the late 1800s, and the people from Hamburg, Germany, brought with them their custom of serving ground meat, which was not common in the United States in those days. And people started calling that ground meat hamburgers after the people from Hamburg, Germany. So the name really comes from the city of origin, Hamburg, Germany. But the next time you have a hamburger, realize there ain't no ham in hamburgers, but we call them hamburgers. And as far as the hot dog goes, you want that story?
Oh, yes, I'm listening.
Okay. Hot dogs, originally had, although they still do have different kind of names. Some people call them wieners or saucy or frankfurters. And the story is, in the early 1900s, the term hot dog did not exist. As I say, people called them frankfurters or wieners, and those names came from their city of origin, Frankfurt, Germany, where they were served, and wieners came from Vienna in the German language used in Austria. Vienna is pronounced Wien, W-E-I-N, and that's where wieners came from, the word wieners. Anyhow, that's what people basically call them here in the United States. And they had no bun. It was just, the piece of meat itself was called a wiener or a frankfurter. But in the early 1800s, there was a baseball game in New York on a very cool day early in the season, and the concessionaire, a guy named Harry Stevens, was noticing that the people weren't buying much food. They didn't have hot food in ballparks in those days. And on a cool day, nobody was buying much food, and he wanted something warm to sell so he could increase his sales that day at the ballpark. So he got the idea of going to a neighborhood. He left the ballpark, went to a neighborhood butcher shop, and asked the butcher, do you have anything warm that I could sell, that I could give my vendors to sell at the ball game? And the butcher said, well, I have some sausages here, if you'd like to take those. And Harry Stevens said, well, okay, but how are the people going to hold them at the game? And the butcher said, well, next door there's a bakery, and they got some buns, so why don't you take the sausages and get some buns and put them in there. So that's what he did. He bought a whole bunch of sausages and a whole bunch of buns, went back to the ballpark, gave them to his vendors, and the vendors were going through the stands holding up the sausage in a bun. And there was a cartoonist at the game that day, a fellow named Tad Dorgan. In those days, this is early 1900s, most newspapers had big cartoons on the front page. That was a tradition in newspapers. And of course, in those days, there were lots of, New York had something like 12 daily newspapers in those days before television and radio. So anyhow, this cartoonist, Tad Dorgan, was one of the leading cartoonists in New York at the time. And he saw the vendors going through the stands holding up a sausage in a bun. And the sausage reminded him of a dachshund. So to be funny, he drew a cartoon of a dachshund in a bun. And he was going to call his cartoon Hot Dachshund. So he's finishing the cartoon. He's on deadline. He had to get the cartoon back to the newspaper, and he was working on the title, and he was going to call it Hot Dachshund. But at the last minute, he decided he wasn't quite sure how to spell dachshund. So he took the easy way out, and he called it Hot Dog. And that's where the name came from. And that cartoon, that original cartoon by Tad Dorgan, which named the hot dog, is at the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York. You can see that cartoon even today, the original cartoon which named hot dogs.
See, now that's incredible, because the hot dog was always then made to complement baseball.
Well, it's like people ate sausages, of course, or frankfurters or wieners, whatever you want to call them, long before that, but not in a bun. That really created what we know as a hot dog. And that's very close to the hamburger story. We mentioned that hamburgers were named after the people from Hamburg, Germany, when they brought the custom of ground meat here. But those weren't hamburgers as we know them today. The hamburger in a bun, which we do know as hamburgers today, in other words, originally the meat was just sold or just eaten or just served in homes as a meat patty, not in a bun. But there was a diner in New Haven, Connecticut, which, by the way, is still there. It's called Louis' Lunch. And in the early 1900s, there were some construction workers working nearby Louis' Lunch. And at lunchtime, they went over to Louis' Lunch to get some lunch, and they wanted to take the food back to their construction site with them. They wanted to eat at the construction site for whatever reason and not stay in the restaurant. So they said, do you have something we could carry our lunch with us back to our construction site? And Louis had some hamburger patties on the grill, and he noticed nearby he had some buns, so he put the hamburger patties in the buns to give the workers so they could carry the hamburger patties back to their workstation. And that created the hamburgers we know today, the hamburger in a bun. That was, and the Smithsonian Institution, by the way, verifies that story, and they have a plaque, and they credit Louis' Lunch with originating the hamburger in a bun as we know it today. And by the way, Louis' Lunch is still there in New Haven. Any of your listeners in that area, or anytime you're in New Haven for any reason, Louis' Lunch is still there, and this is like over 100 years later after the invention of the hamburger on a bun there. And his name was Louis Larson, the guy that owned the store, and the Larson family still, it's either his granddaughter or great-granddaughter runs the place today. It's still there. And they are recognized as the originator of the hamburger in a bun.
You can add sandwiches and sushi to that as well, all made to keep your hands from getting messy.
That's right. Yeah, same thing with a hot dog and a hamburger. When we stop to think about it, originally they were not in buns, and so you had to eat them off a plate. How could a person be born in both Florida and Missouri? Now, those states are pretty far apart. How could a person be born in both Florida and Missouri? There was a very famous person who indeed was born in Florida and Missouri, and that was Mark Twain, the famous writer, who, it turns out, it was in a little town in northeast Missouri where he was born. The name of the town was Florida. It was Florida, Missouri, where he was born, and he was born in 1835. He went all through his life, telling people, I was born in both Florida and Missouri, and he really was, because he was born in the town of Florida in the state of Missouri.
How could you be born on Venus and Florida?
Well, same way, right?
Yeah, it is Venus, Florida.
Venus, Florida, that's right. Very good. I got to tell you this story, Russell. People seem to love this one. And we verified this is true, and I'll tell you how we found out it's true after I tell the story. Queen Elizabeth came to the United States. Queen Elizabeth from Great Britain came to the United States in the late 1970s when Gerald Ford was president in the late 1970s. And she came here for a state visit, and there was an elaborate dinner at the White House in her honor in the East Room. And all during dinner, the U.S. Marine Band, which is the official band for the U.S. president, was on the bandstand playing music while everybody was having dinner. And then after dinner, President Ford got up and went to Queen Elizabeth to ask her for the first dance. And he led her to the dance floor. And the U.S. Marine Band played the next song that just happened to be on their music stand. They just turned the page, all the music they've been playing all evening during dinner. They turned the page to the next song they had on their music stand. And of all the songs in the world, that next song that they played as President Ford led Queen Elizabeth to the dance floor, the song was "The Lady is a Tramp." And we say in our book, Queen Elizabeth apparently took that very well. We didn't have any problems with England. So anyhow, I'd written that story. We had a syndicated newspaper column, and I'd written that story in the 1990s. President Ford was still living then. He was president, as you know, in the late 1970s. And I was telling a friend of mine who grew up in England, I was telling him that story. I said, of all things, President Ford led Queen Elizabeth to the dance floor, and of all the songs in the world, the Marine Corps band played The Lady is a Tramp. And my friend said, I don't think that's true. He said, because this fellow who grew up in England, he said, because I don't think the Queen dances with commoners. I think the Queen only dances with royalties. I'm not sure she would dance with Gerald Ford. So I said, geez, maybe I had gotten this story somewhere. I don't remember where I originally got it, or if it was just in the news when it happened. But anyhow, I wanted to check on it, and my wife had worked with, my wife is in public relations, and had worked with a woman who was very active in the Republican Party and was very friendly with the Bush family and with Gerald Ford. And as I say, Gerald Ford was still living. This is somewhere in the 1990s. So I asked my wife to ask this woman if by any chance she had Gerald Ford's telephone number. He was living at the time in Palm Springs in his retirement. He was living in Palm Springs, California. And she did have his phone number. So I called. I called the number, and a guy answered the phone. It was not Gerald Ford. It was his man described as his male secretary. So I said that I was a reporter, and I had written a story about President Ford leading Queen Elizabeth to the dance floor and the band playing Lady is a Tramp. I said I just wanted to verify that it really did happen. And the male secretary said, well, let me check, and I'll call you back. And he took my phone number. And sure enough, in about 15 minutes, the phone rang, and it wasn't Gerald Ford, but it was the secretary. And he said, yes, he told that story to Gerald Ford, and yes, it did happen. It was true. So we know that really did happen. And that's just a great story about...
Way to go, Charles.
Yeah, yes, we were lucky to be able to confirm that. And that is therefore a true story.
Wow. Let me ask you something. Is trivia knowledge?
Yeah, the word trivia originally meant things that weren't too important.
Yeah, trivial.
And the word trivial comes from that. But I don't like the word trivia because I don't think this is trivial. That's why we called the book The All-Time Book of Fascinating Facts. We've had so many cases, Russell, and I'm just so thrilled. I just talked to somebody who was on a long automobile trip, and they took our book and they said they made the trip go faster because they kept asking each other, people in the car, questions from the book. And we've had so many cases like that. And it's knowledgeable too. I think, as varied as the questions and answers are, there's also a lot of knowledge there too, and interesting information, not just what I would call trivial information.
Well, I've definitely learned something today. Charles, without repeating what we've already done, give me your next best fact from the all-time book of fascinating facts.
Well, it's so hard to pick one. You want some coincidences with 9/11, the 9/11 attack?
We have a huge conspiratorial audience here, so much like the Coast to Coast audience. So, yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, all right, 9/11. We all know about that attack on September 11th, 1901. So many coincidences. The first plane to hit the World Trade Center was Flight 11. There were 92 people on that plane. 9 plus 2 is 11. The next plane hit the Pentagon. The words "the Pentagon" have 11 letters. Oh, the first one was in New York City. New York City has 11 letters. The third plane crashed near a town called Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Shanksville has 11 letters in it. The groundbreaking for the Pentagon was on September 11th, 1941. The president at the time this happened was George W. Bush, 11 letters in his name. The World Trade Center, the Twin Towers there, standing side by side, looked like the number 11. There are exactly, after September 11th each year, there are exactly 111 days left in the year. So we got a lot of 11s. Those are the ones I can think of. I think we got even some more of those in our book. Just an amazing coincidences with that number 11 on September 11th. And one more. Our emergency phone call just happens to be 911, right? 911.
Yes, I think we all spotted that one, Charles.
Yeah. So that fits in there too. Yep. I'll give you one more quickie if you like. Happy Birthday to You. Everybody knows the song. It's one of the many famous songs, not written by a famous songwriter. In fact, hardly anybody knows who wrote it. Everybody knows Happy Birthday to You. In fact, it's called the most sung song in America. But hardly anybody knows who wrote it. And it was two school-teaching sisters in Lexington, Kentucky, Mildred and Patty Hill, who originally wrote a song called Good Morning to All, and it was meant to be a classroom greeting as the kids came into school each day. And then one day they found out that one of the kids was having a birthday the next day, so that evening they changed the words from Good Morning to All to Happy Birthday to You, and the rest is history. It became one of the great songs of all time. And the amazing thing is, as I said, that everybody knows the song, but hardly anybody knows who wrote it. And here are these two obscure teachers. This was back in the late 1800s, Mildred and Patty Hill, who wrote one of our greatest songs. And you can go even further on that. So many songs have been written by non-songwriters. The words to the Star-Spangled Banner, written by Francis Scott Key, who was not a songwriter. He was a lawyer. America the Beautiful was written by Catherine Lee Bates, who was an English teacher in college. The magnificent music of Taps. It's probably one of the most haunting melodies we have, right? Taps. It was written by an Army general who had never written another song before or after in his lifetime. He wrote just one song, and it was the beautiful, poignant melody of Taps. So you don't have to be a famous songwriter to write a great song.
The all-time book of fascinating facts, that's 32 letters, which is the atomic number of germanium. I'll ask one more. I got to ask it because I'm interested. Why are police officers called cops?
Okay, there are a couple of theories on that. The most prevalent one, the most accepted one, is that in the 1800s, it was traditional, especially in the big cities in the East, for police officers to wear copper buttons and copper badges. That was the tradition of police uniforms in those days. And when a police officer came into view, people would say, "Here comes the copper," referring to the copper button or the copper badges. And so they started calling police officers coppers. And of course, that name copper was later shortened to cop. And that's why we call them cops today. It came from the word copper.
Charles Reichblum, where can the audience learn more about you and even contact you?
Well, we have a website, knowledgeinanutshell.com. You can go there, read all about the book, and it also has a biography of myself. It has an order form. If you'd like to order the book, you can do it there. Again, the price is $19.95, including shipping and handling. So it's knowledgeinanutshell.com, or you can call our 800 number, 1-800-NUTSHELL. 1-800-NUTSHELL, or knowledgeinanutshell.com.
Charles, in a nutshell, I had a great time today.
Great being with you, Russell. Great being with you.
Yeah, I just really love this kind of stuff. So now I'm going to tell everybody what I've learned.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Charles Reichblum, for being a guest on the program.
Thank you, Russell.